Hello, my name is Claudette, also known as Cloudette because I love clouds and looking up. I identify as a soul. Not only do I identify as a soul, I have discovered proof that I am part of a infinite soul's journey that, as far as I am aware of, began in 1562. And I am ever so grateful to the anarcho COVID, Macy, Jeff Barrett's, of course, that I've been following and listening to for over 10 years, to have an opportunity to share my story with all of you, and more importantly, share how Skystrology, which is a organic and philosophical understanding of the stars, can reconnect us, collective, to our organic and celestial selves. So I want to just first begin a little bit of background information about myself. I was born in the USA, but I turned 21 in Berlin, Germany, and I haven't really lived there since. I conceived the concept of Skystrology in Egypt on the Red Sea while I was taking care of my mother, who had dementia and Alzheimer's. And this change of, the waking up that I'm sure a lot of us have had, but my waking up in around 2010, 2012 coincided with my fiance passing and me thinking, what is this again all about? So thinking again, because I remember having all the time these thoughts as a young child and not really understanding why we were here. Like, we just can't be here to do the things we're doing. And so when I was in Egypt and taking care of my mother, I was also waking up to the fact that Western astrology, the mainstream astrology that most people use and believe, is not what it says it is. And by that, I mean the language that is associated with Western and mainstream astrology says that they are sharing what is actually happening in the sky at that moment. And that is the language that they're using. But the fact is that they are not. And during this time that NASA, never a straight answer, wanted to alert people that there wasn't 12 signs, there were 13, was a prompt, in my humble opinion, for people to start to look up and start to think, well, what is actually happening? Because even myself, who got a astrology reading on my 20th birthday over 30 years ago, did not look up. I was too busy looking in a book called An Ephemeris with a lot of numbers talking about what was actually supposedly happening in the sky. So during this time of waking up, I discovered also that this information I was using wasn't correct. And after a few years of totally disassociating myself from astrology, luckily enough, I ran into two biodynamic farmers in Scotland who more or less reintroduced me to the actual influence that the heavenly bodies position in the actual sky have on the earth plane. And from that moment on, I started to do my own investigation, very discerning investigation, because I was cautious about all that I was led to believe before. This, of course, coincided with me taking care of my mother, waking up to the concept of Ubuntu, which is a African philosophy about if one person isn't okay, nobody is okay. And that just resonated so strongly with me. It resonated with me when I made the decision to drop my career as a hat maker that I had been active for over 30 years and take the call to take my mother on board and take her to Egypt. Well, first to London, but that wasn't good for Alzheimer's and arthritis. And then we ended up in Egypt basically because of her. Thanks to this decision, I was able to live on and off, but for periods of time, under an Egyptian clear night sky. And this night sky introduced me to the energetics of stars. And I learned also my constellations. And when I was having this daily experience of just being in the middle of nowhere on the Red Sea in a gated, quiet, very small community, I could see the sun rising as the moon setting. I could see the moon rising out of the Red Sea on a full moon. And one day, very poignant day, as I observed, sitting on the sand and looking up to the sky, I could see how the moon was amongst the stars of Taurus, that I had learned that constellation. And the Western media, newspapers, and especially the internet, this was around 2017, was saying that the moon, the full moon, was in Gemini. And even though I had kind of, like I said, picked up on what the information, NASA information had told us, it wasn't until actually witnessing that myself that I started to make real connections. And the first thing that I thought that I'll never forget, because it was an unusual thought to come into my mind, because I wasn't raised religiously, and I'm very weary of, the whole idea of God said this or whatever. So I thought, oh, they're hiding God because they can't hide the sky. And so that began a journey where I felt called to really research how impactful following the true sky was. And that included knowing where the heavenly bodies were on a daily basis, and started a podcast and started to speak to people I knew about it. And more importantly, I started to see the stars in a different light and started to do some deep stargazing and some sun gazing, just really basic reconnecting to the heavenly bodies. And this was, I did in Egypt until 2018 when my mother passed, and then I came back to London thinking I'm just gonna pack up, go back to Egypt. I love it so much. And then I think a little bit of my old self was like, oh, you can do your hats too, and then you can do part-time London, part-time Egypt, and you've got grandchildren here and everything. So I moved everything into a studio that I could only stay in during the day. And I was running figures about different people's birth time in the studio, doing the podcast, whatever I could do to give myself the confidence that this method, this idea could actually help people. Because like I said, I was very cautious after following Western astrology for 30 years. So one fated day, actually the day that I was at the airport, so I need to put this in because what happened when I was like a Mad Hatter scientist, I always say, looking at the figures and trying to verify the idea of Skystrology, I forgot about all the normal things to do, like making money, and my inheritance had ran out, and I could just afford my studio, but it was only daytime access, so from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. And I could only afford my flat rent in Egypt, and therefore I did not have anywhere to sleep in the evening. So I created this rhythm where I was sleeping part-time in my studio during the day on a little couch, and the rest of the time doing my podcast and running information about Skystrology. And during that time, I also found out that a lot of people were getting into astrology, and I felt, oh no, they can't because it's not right. And so I was working on a pitch deck. I was doing everything I could to kind of hurry up and validate this method that I felt was more accurate. And so in 2019, actually, I ended up just finding myself comfortable in the night at the Heathrow International Airport, where there was unlimited Wi-Fi and cafes, and it was safe and warm, and I could continue my studies on my laptop. And then I would, over the night, in the nighttime, and then I would go and sleep in my studio part-time in the day, and then I would continue working at the same time. And there were always little things that were inspiring me to do this. But in August 29th, 2019, a friend who had known for 20 years was a bit distraught that I was at the airport, and she was like, what about your hats? Why aren't you doing your hats? And I was telling her about Skystrology, but she's not really into that. And she was telling me, you should be putting your energy into something so woohoo. You should go back to your hats. And I was grateful that she, cared enough. She even started a pitch deck, started the research for me. And so I felt I needed to do my part. And next to doing Skystrology research, I started to go back to do my hat research, which had a long story from 30 years of coincidences with names and dates. But when I started that 30 years ago, there wasn't the internet, and I, had sometime revisited this concept of souls or reincarnation, as people think, but it wasn't 100% clear to me how that could be, even though there was tons of coincidences that I'll give you a link to that if you're curious about. In any event, on that day, I did some research, and I found, when searching about this hat that I had patented and given a name of Isabel, and that this name of Isabel was connected to this past life story, I found a drawing, because there weren't photographs in the 1500s, of a woman who looked like me. And I thought, you're just imagining things, but I took a screenshot at that time. Then later that day, or in those days, I remembered that there was a karmic transit that was approaching my karmic point in my sky. I call it a sky, not a natal chart. Okay. And it was beyond exact. So we kind of look at these things by degrees, and that's a big part of the math to it, to Skystrology, that we look at also the vibration of the number, the numerology of it. And not just the degree, but also the arch minute is like the relationship between minutes and seconds, which makes it even more exact. And this alignment was exact by degree and arch minute. And there was a succession of things that happened that was reaffirming this, just totally out of, just out of the ordinary. That convinced me and gave me the confidence to go forth and believe and have the confidence to share Skystrology with first a small group of people on Instagram, and then it caught the attention of someone else who was an influencer who shared Skystrology far and wide. And that was necessary because I was able then to practice this concept that I had been putting together in Egypt and when I was in my studio in London with different people that I didn't know, and it resonated, and they said it changed their lives. And now I have a community of souls that are learning how to use this method, and who I certify as Skystrologers. We also have a mindset experience where I share all the connections that it seems the universe wanted to give through me, through my soul, proof of this phenomena of the fact that the soul is eternal, that the soul remembers, and that this is a way for us to wake up to our true spiritual selves, which doesn't really align with the programs that we all have been indoctrinated with since we came out of the womb. Which brings me to my topic of this conversation, which is how Skystrology can reconnect us to our organic and celestial selves. So as I spoke about, I was stargazing, and stargazing is a big part of Skystrology because it allows us to interact without, I feel, any intervention of what's happening here, and to have a exercise of proverbially looking up and physically looking up to the magic of just twinkling stars, particular bright stars that our ancestors would have also seen, would have also connected with, would have looked towards to live in harmony with the rhythm of this earth plane and all living creatures on it. So I always say that I am thankful for COVID, really thankful for COVID, because I feel like COVID was 9/11 number 2, because we saw that there were people waking up, but when you think about what a spectacle it was, there wasn't really enough outrage, in my humble opinion. And that's normal because it was a shock and awe, right? We were so shocked. Even myself, just this year, even though I knew it was staged, it was this year that I could clearly 1,000% see it was CGI. Of course, we know there's no building. There's building 7, which ends all conversations. But how much did I know about how a plane goes into a building? And to know that it took 20 years for me to see that that wasn't a plane going into that building, of course, allows me to wake up to those who don't even think it was staged at all. In any event, I do believe all things happen for a reason. And this COVID is the event that a lot of people were thinking and saying, oh, it's coming. Something's coming. We don't know what it is, but it's coming, right? And for me, by what I do with my work, which I want to just go back to Skystrology, is we honor the womb space, the womb, the holding space, the dream space, as the Aborigines say, the soul space, where a miracle happens literally in less than 10 months of a baby coming from a tiny, tiny cell that you can barely see with the naked eye, and a sperm, to create these water beings, creating an earth entity that lives in water, and that when it's ready comes through its mother mouth. I have to say mother mouth because that's German. Muttermund means the cervix, and I just think that's brilliant. So the being, that the magical being, comes through perfect most times, with all the bits and pieces it needs, with fingernails and, heart and all the things it needs to grow and to live and survive. That's the plan. But as soon as we come into this world, there are these injections. And even myself, with 2 children, I didn't think anything of it. It's so programmed, it's such the norm, that it wasn't until I was 45, somebody said to me, their children weren't vaccinated. And she said, that's your child. You can decide what to do. And I looked at her like she was telling me something that was, foreign, that, I didn't even think about from that perspective before. So this COVID vaccination agenda has been going on for a very, very long time. And this event, this shock, horror, has a way of waking even more people up. And it has woken a lot of people up. And so what do we do, as this forum is asking? What do we do now that we are awake to the agenda, to the agendas that have been running for, as Max Egan says, since the beginning of time? They've done this before. As the measuring moon, we call it in Skystrology, because we don't know what it is, right? And the people who are obviously in power, I don't want to really give it power, but in the so-called power to make these decisions on ourselves, especially now that it's gotten personal, right? It's gotten personal because they want to inject adults, they want to inject children. So I suppose that, of course, a lot of people in my age didn't have as many injections as the children born today. So this COVID was, of course, an excuse to, of course, take away a lot of independence that was left from artists, from self-employed, from independent people. It was there to perpetuate fear of ourselves. And it was there to bring in this mass vaccination agenda. And how it was done and the time that it was done, I could see with using the actual position of the heavenly bodies in the sky, that it was an agenda, but I could also see that it is an opportunity for us to know that there is another option. There are a lot of options, and that they are valid options, and that it is possible. And in my experience, what my soul has shown me is that because the soul lives on, and the challenges of the soul in other lifetimes also lives on, that I am here to be aware of that. And in this vessel, in this earth body, this soul is called to do better, to take action about the aspects of my experience that I know about and that I feel called to change.